There are two sermons in two Gospels with a very similar message, but with one big difference. I'm talking about the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. In Matthew, Jesus delivers a sermon from a mountain with the people down below. And in Luke, he delivers a sermon standing on level ground, looking at people in the eye. Now, you might have heard of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, but have you heard of the Sermon on the Plain found in the Gospel of Luke? Now, this sermon is talked about less than its more famous counterpart, probably because they sound so similar. But they're not exactly alike, even when they're saying similar things. They have a slightly different focus, and this makes the takeaways different. So I'm going to describe the similarities between these two sermons, but then I'm going to look at each of these sermons' focus and how they contrast. And I'll also talk about how that contrast determines what we learn from each of them. And before we go on, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that one of these sermons is more important than the other. Both sermons have valuable messages, even if they're slightly different. Now, the entire text for the Sermon on the Plain is found in the description, and I will show some of the text on the screen as I talk about it as I go along. Now, the similarities with these sermons starts with how the sermons came about. A crowd formed, and Jesus took the opportunity to teach the crowd. Now, these two sermons aren't the only time that happened. There are other passages where Jesus taught the crowds, but these are the two sermons where a large amount of the content was written down. Now, another similarity between the two is that the content and the types of illustrations used are very similar between the two. They both have sections where Jesus has a list of instructions that start with, "Blessed are you." They both have instructions around the idea of loving your enemies and a nonviolent response when you're wronged. In both sermons, he tells the people if someone strikes you on your cheek to turn the other cheek. Both sermons have short parable-type illustrations, such as building the house on a firm foundation so that when the storms come, the house will stand. Now, at first glance, the Sermon on the Plain just sounds like a more concise version of the Sermon on the Mount. And so it makes sense that the Sermon on the Mount gets more airtime. But there are some significant differences that make them both valuable to study. Matthew's Sermon on the Mount digs into the inner character that drives our morality. Jesus starts some of his teachings in that sermon with, "You have heard it said," and then he describes something from the law. But then he goes on to say, "But I say unto you," and then describes something about the inner character or the inner thought life that reveals the root inner character that can lead to that outer sin. Now, one example of this is when Jesus said, "You have heard that it is said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus raises the requirement of morality beyond actions down to the thought life and inner motivations. And while Luke's Sermon on the Plain also addresses morality, instead of focusing on the inner thought life, the Sermon on the Plain focuses more on the outer lived experiences. The sermon found in Luke's Gospel doesn't have the texts that look at the inner thoughts. And while variations of the remaining texts in Luke's sermon are also found in Matthew's Gospel, with the inner reflection texts removed, it causes the focus to be much more on how we treat people. Do not judge. Love your enemies. The measure you use will be measured unto you. You will know a tree by its fruit. This undiluted focus on our actions brings a more pointed message. How we treat people really matters to God. Now, to drive that point home, there was one part in the Sermon on the Plain that the Sermon on the Mount doesn't have. It has a section of woes. After the verses that say, "Blessed are you who are poor, who are hungry, and who weep," Luke's Gospel includes three woes: to those who are rich, to those who are full, to those who laugh now. So while the Sermon on the Mount is calling people to make sure they're not just obeying the rules, their obedience should go all the way down to their inner life. The Sermon on the Plain has more of a focus on the external treatment of the people around us. Jesus plainly tells them that the poor, the rejected, the grieving will be blessed. God sees and upholds the marginalized, the excluded, and the abused. And he also tells the rich and powerful, with words of judgment, that their riches will cause them turmoil and distress. Now, we don't know what behind the scenes injustices Jesus was addressing in this sermon. It's probably the same injustices that we see in all times and places. The crowd that was listening to this sermon probably included both classes of people. The rich and the poor in that society were most likely mingling. Nobody is riding through town in their large SUV with the tinted windows, emerging only after they get behind the security gates of their mansion. The rich are carrying out their business while the poor are sitting nearby asking for alms. This means that the poor people might be going hungry right in front of the rich people who have more than enough. In the Sermon on the Plain, I see judgment for the hoarding of wealth, callousness towards their neighbor, and apathy in the face of suffering. This text offers hope for the marginalized, not just for a distant future time, but in the present, for those of us that want to do the will of God. These issues of justice are part of the kingdom of God that we work towards now. Jesus cared about the poor, the sick, and the outcast. And if we call ourselves followers of Jesus, we will care about these issues and these people and do what we can to help. This sermon is blunt and has an air of finality. However, we should also remember that Luke also wrote about rich people, rich and powerful people who found redemption. This Sermon on the Plain shines a light on oppression. Inequality was so rampant, it had become mundane. So this isn't condemnation, but it is a wake-up call. Some who were complicit heard that wake-up call and followed. Everyone is invited into God's rest. Now, I think the marginalized are closer to that rest because everything else has been stripped away from their lives already. The rich, while also invited, may not be looking for God's rest because they're already self-sufficient. So how does this apply to us today? Now, I could try to connect those dots for you, but I think it's more powerful for you to bring this text to God and reflect on your very unique and specific situation. And you could bring this to God and ask questions like, where do I fall in this? What can I learn? What would you have me do today? The Sermon on the Plain reminds us that the kingdom of God is not just some future hope, but a present reality, breaking into our world through compassion, justice, and love. Jesus invites us to see the people right in front of us, to stand on level ground with them, and to respond with an awareness that how we treat others is how we respond to Him. May we have ears to hear the wake-up call and hearts ready to live it out.